I think we could produce a great novel if only we could get time to sit down and write it. Well, we all do, but very few of us actually make it. But our next guest did appear, and her novel is called Dream of Other Days, and it's already a bestseller. Not only that, but the paperback rights have been sold for £67,500, which is the highest sum ever paid for a first novel in Britain. Now, she's one of our own, and the book, Dream of Other Days, is set in Ireland. It's a long, historical novel set in Ireland about the time of the famine. It encompasses and includes all of that area of the famine. What makes her success even sweeter is that she left school at 14, she became a seamstress, and she's the mother of 6 and a grandmother. And the nicest part of all is that although she lives now in Wales, she was born in the Coombe in Dublin and lived in Clanbrassil Street and in Kimmage. So would you welcome, please, Elaine Crowley. Nice story. Elaine Crowley. There you are. How are you doing? Do sit down, and congratulations to you. Isn't it wonderful what's happening to you all this time?
Dream.
Isn't it just like a dream come true after all that effort and scribbling and writing and everything else? What just occurs to me to ask you, what did you actually find out that was new to you about the famine when you were doing your research for the book?
No, I don't think I did find out anything really that was new that I hadn't already read before I had decided to start writing. But what I did do in my research was authenticated it, you know?
How do you mean authenticated?
By reading
Elaine?
it, by going back and finding books. I had had so much told to me by my mother, mostly though by Irish people in Wales, because most of the people in Port Talbot where I live are people whose ancestors would have come there because of the famine, you see.
Yes.
And so they would tell you these stories.
And did you find out anything about whether it was government policy in Britain to eradicate the Irish peasants by means of the
Oh, no, I don't think it was, from what I've read. I read The Great Hunger when it was first published, and I felt like that, you know, and felt terribly angry. I still feel very angry, but the second time that I read it, by which time I had read other historical things about it, I don't think it was a policy. It wasn't like the genocide. It wasn't a definite policy to eradicate them, but it was a great lack of care, that they didn't care, but there was no deliberate policy not then to eradicate
I was thinking when
them.
I was reading the book and all that happened, when you consider that with Ethiopia today, and in this modern age, we have all the planes, we have the jet planes, we have the teleprinters, we have the computers, we have all the means of communication, and yet there are people dying in their thousands.
Yes, but I think, again, that's the same thing. It is the lack of care. You see, I think what's happening in Ethiopia, the drought, like with the blight, well, that was an act of God, which couldn't be prevented, but the conditions were such that when you did have this act of God, that it had the most appalling effect. Like if the Irish hadn't been, the poor Irish, totally dependent on potatoes, and the potato had failed, well, you wouldn't have had the thousands and thousands die. And the same with the government in Ethiopia, if they had taken more interest in the land. So when you had this drought, or if they had some system of looking after the peasants, yes, in Ethiopia too. So I think really the fault is on caring people, on caring governments.
Talk to me about Clanbrassil Street and all that area now. You remember it very well. Were you very poor, Elaine?
No. We weren't very, very poor, because my father worked up until he was 7. And he worked for an undertaking firm, and they earned a reasonable wage, which then I suppose was about £2.10. This was in the 1930s, and that would have been the average working man's wage. But on top of that, an undertaker got very generous tips, more generous tips from burying poor families. You know, they'd have the insurance money. And they'd give him tips.
And did he drive a hearse, your father?
He drove a horse, a
hearse. With horses?
Yes. Sometimes with two horses, sometimes with 4, depending on how much society money there was. You know, they'd give a great funeral.
Yeah.
And, but then when I was 7, he got consumption, you see. And from then on, until he died when I was 14, he was in and out of work. So during the time, of course, he was out of work, although my mother had a sister who was very good to her and helped her, and his people, because my father was from England, they would help us, and relations in America, but it wasn't on a regular basis. You see, it wasn't something you could depend
on.
on.
And how old was your father when he died?
39.
39,
yeah.
And he died eventually of consumption.
He did, in the hospice, yeah.
Mind you, they were dying like flies around.
Everybody. I mean, it wasn't just us. There were thousands and thousands, whole families.
Yeah.
And when I worked in Sabins in Cecilia Street, that's where I went to work.
Making clothes?
Making clothes, yes. Yeah. It was a tailoring firm.
Yeah.
And an awful lot of the young boys and girls died there, you know, because it tended, on the whole, to strike people from their teens into their early adulthood.
Yeah. Yes. Now, you were 7 then when your daddy died?
No, I was 7 when he got it.
When he got
it.
Yes. So,
and I was 14 when he died.
So you were able to go to work then straight away?
I had to go to work.
And how much were you earning at that time?
11 and 6 a week when I started, and I gave my mother 10 shillings, and I had 1 and 6 for myself.
Yes. You gave your mother 10 shillings.
10 shillings.
And you came home, what, every Thursday or Friday and handed up your
Oh, no, Saturday we got paid in the beginning, because when I first worked, you worked on Saturday till 1 o'clock.
Yes.
And I can't remember exactly, after 2 or 3 years there, maybe the unions must have done something, and we didn't have to work on Saturdays anymore, and that was great, you see, so then you'd get paid on a Friday. But eventually, my money went up, you see, and I got a rise, and one day I must have been bringing home more than £1. So I was giving my mother £1 and something. And years afterwards, she told me that that was the most marvellous thing in her life, when for the first time since my father had finished work, that she handled an unbroken £1 note. You know, because she got a 15 and 6 widow's pension, and she must have got something like 10 and 6. It would have been the equivalent of our social security, but it was relief then, and there was much more shame attached to it than... I know some people still feel ashamed of getting social security they're entitled to, but in those days it was dreadful, you see, relief. But she never had an unbroken £1. So I got this rise, and I was bringing her home the £1, and she told me years afterwards, she'd go to bed with the thought of this. Now, she had this £1 to start off the week, pay 7 and 6, that's what the house cost, rent on the Monday, and then she had the 12 and 6 to see her in through the week, and then she thought she was on the pig's back.
She'd start the week with an unbroken £1.
Start the week with an unbroken £1.
Isn't that pathetic? Yeah. Isn't it extraordinary? Now, there was a great Jewish settlement down around Clanbrassil Street, and you mixed very freely and were friends with all of them.
Our neighbours. We lived, you see, in Clanbrassil Street until I was about 8. When after my father got consumption, we moved out then to Kimmage.
Why?
And we lived out there. Well, there was a better housing conditions, you see. It was a bigger house, because we lived in rooms in Clanbrassil Street over a salt shop.
A salt shop?
Yeah, they brought...
They sold only salt?
They sold only salt. They brought great big blocks and bars of salt to this shop, and then they mixed it up and sent it out in, you know, the cardboard boxes of salt, and that's what it was known as, the salt shop, you see. So we had our name down for this house, and people would be going down to Lord Edward Street, you know, to see if they were moving up on the list. And of course my poor unfortunate mother got moved up on the list much quicker than she should have done, because my father had TB, you see, so they gave you priority. And we got this house out in Kimmage, but my mother never liked it. She was too far from the city. And of course it was a great hardship, because you had to spend bus fare, you know, to go into town to get more economical. Well, your messages were dearer if you bought them out in Kimmage from the new shops.
And you went in every week still to Clanbrassil Street?
Oh, my mother used to go in every week into Clanbrassil. And you'd walk, of course, you'd walk. It was nothing to... I used to walk from Kimmage into Cecilia Street every morning to work, and stop off at Whitefriars Street on the way, you know, and sometimes catch mass or just say a few prayers, and walk home again in the evening.
And did you eat the Jewish food when you were in Clanbrassil Street?
Well, yes, we would... my mother had a great liking for their pickled cucumbers, like the dill cucumbers, like gherkins now. And there was a shop there called Ordman's, which would have barrels of these standing outside, and we'd have those. And my mother would very often buy their bread. They made beautiful bread, gorgeous bread, lovely duck loaves and bagels. And the other thing that we always really look forward to was the Jewish Passover, which is usually near enough to our Easter festival. And they eat this lovely unleavened bread matzahs, you know, and they would always give to their Christian neighbours. Looked rather like water biscuits, paler than water biscuits. They give us packets
and
of
what's
these.
this about you as kids lighting their fires for them?
On a Saturday, with the very Orthodox Jewish people, and most of them were very Orthodox
in
when I was a little girl. And you would get a penny for lighting their gas, because it was their Sabbath, you see, and they weren't allowed to do anything. The food would be prepared from the previous day, and you would light the gas, or you'd put a match to the fire and get a penny. I get a penny.
You get a penny for doing that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, as long as they didn't do it, it was all right. So somebody else had to do it.
Yeah.
Yes. So there, how many children were there in your family altogether after your
Well, my
daddy
mother
died?
had 8, but only 3 of us lived.
Yeah.
She lost the others, so there was 3 when my father died. I was the oldest.
Yes.
And I.
By the way, tell them about the Sacred Heart of Jesus, man.
Okay.
Mary just reminded me of that.
Well, when we lived in Clonbrassil Street, there were several beggars, you see, who used to come. People used to come and they'd sing in the street or play musical instruments, and you'd throw pennies to them, you know, out through the window. But there were a few who did actually come up to the house, you see, and they'd knock on the door. And there was one man in particular who came on a Thursday night, and my mother called him the loving and sacred heart of Jesus man. And on a Thursday, she'd put the sixpence, and sixpence was a fair amount of money, you know, in those days.
And she hadn't got it.
She'd put the sixpence in the egg cup, you see, now, and put that on the dress. Said, that's for the loving and sacred heart of Jesus, man. And Thursday night, there'd be a knock on the door, and sometimes I'd open it, so I saw him, and I'd hear my mother describe him. Very respectable, decent-looking man, she'd say. And he had a soft hat and a dust coat and a hay-coloured moustache. And he'd say, good evening, ma'am, and she'd give him the money, and he'd say, may the loving and sacred heart, he'd give you the blessing, you know. May the loving and sacred heart of Jesus bless and protect you. And my mother would come in and she'd say, a decent man, he was well.
So wait. There's a tag.
My mother then had a friend who lived over the north side, and occasionally she'd go over there. So one night she went over to see this Rosie, you see, and she was having tea and Rosie's, and there was a knock came to the door, and my mother went and opened it, and it was the loving and sacred heart of Jesus. So my mother went in and said to Rosie, there's the loving and sacred heart of Jesus man there. So Rosie went out, and she came back in and she said, no, she said, that was Mr. Murphy. He was giving me the money for the girls' elocution fees. His daughters are in the convent with my daughter. He had a round on the south side, because it wasn't only from my mother he got the sixpence, everyone in the street. And that's what he earned his living at. He begged on the south side and educated his family on the north side.
It's a great system. It's a great system. You see? Which shows yet again that God looks after his own.
That's right.
And if you live right, and you see the nun in the convent where you were teaching in Port Talbot, I believe, also said that she would pray to Saint Anthony for the success. Sister Security.
Yeah.
Security?
Security, that's the name.
Security. Sounds like a
Security.
Yeah. Anyway, Sister Security said that she would pray to St. Anthony for the success of your book.
She did.
Very good indeed. But St. Anthony demands 10%, you know that, don't you?
Oh, well, I've given her a few bob already.
Oh, no, it's 10%.
Oh,
It's 10%. Yes, yes. I promised St. Anthony...
10% of the lot.
Yes, indeed.
Oh.
I've promised St. Anthony 10% of anything I get back, too. But
Oh, I see.
I hope you do better than I do. Now, anyway, the publicity attending your success and all of that, how are you reacting to all of this now, Elaine?
Well, most of the time, Gay, I try to think that it's all a dream, you know, really, that it's not happening to me. Sometimes when I go to bed at night, like last night, I thought to myself, now, I'm going to get all this money, you know, but it's, most of the time still, it's rather as if I'm fantasizing a bit. Like sometimes when I used to listen to you on the radio, I think, now one day maybe he might be interviewing me, but really it was a bit of a fantasy thing.
You are. St. Anthony again, you see
St. Anthony again.
Yeah.
And it hasn't so far, thank God, made all that much difference to my life. I'm still living, you know, where I live. And the only one who really, it's made a great difference to my youngest son's life, because he's a student and permanently overdrawn, you see. So he's the only one really who benefits.
Yes.
Benefits
Is your
from
mother
it.
alive, Elaine?
No, my mother died 5 years ago, on the 31st of October in the hospice.
Here?
Oh, yes, in Harold's Cross Hospice. And my father
your
died
father
there.
died there,
yeah.
too.
And that's where I learned to do an old-fashioned waltz in the hospice on the St. Stephen's Day before my father died, because it is true, this, of what the nuns do, they make people enjoy living until the moment that they die in this hospice movement. And I went to see my father, this was in 1941, and they had one of these little wind-up gramophones in there, and they'd made lovely green bed jackets for all the men, and everyone in that ward was terminal. But they were sitting up, you know, and smiling as much as they could. And they play this, oh, we parted on the shore and the ship, play this. And my auntie, my mother's sister, Lord of Mercy on her, she's dead now, she took me up to waltz, and so did the other visitors. You know, we waltzed all up and round down this ward, and the patients smiled and enjoyed it.
And your father was there then?
My father was there and delighted to see me doing this.
And how long after that did he die?
He died on the 8th of January.
Yes, and this was Stephen's Day, was it?
I was there on
you were there on Stephen's Day, yes, yes. And so did your mother ever go to live with you in Wales?
She did, yes. When my mother was 70, she got an acute glaucoma. And of course it affected her nerves for the time being very badly. And I went with her to the eye and ear, and the specialist was there, this Mr. Tompkin. I said to him, oh, I'm taking my mother over to Wales to live with me. And Mr. Tompkin, who was a man about my mother's age, said that's the worst possible thing you could do. You know, you shouldn't take your mother out of her own home. But anyway, I took her. She gave up the flat she had in. She was living in Ranelagh by this time. And I took her over. She sold up the furniture and what have you. And from the minute she came to live with me, all she did was, she invented this thing about the Pope kissing the ground, you know. She'd say, if only I could get back to Dublin, I'd kneel down and I'd kiss the ground. And she did get back eventually.
Eventually.
She had several operations in Wales.
She chucked Wales and came back, yes.
She loved the people in Wales,
of course,
but she missed Dublin.
Wasn't
you can't
Dublin. Of course you can, of course you can. So now have you another one after the success of this one? Have you another book lined up?
I have. I'm halfway through, but this one is set in Dublin.
Yes.
It's set between 1913 and 1920, and I'm halfway through that.
Yes, and big sales at that, isn't
That's
it?
the trick.
That's the trick. What's the
That's the
trick?
trick.
Bill?
That's the trick, is to keep going.
Oh, to keep going, yeah.
Going, yeah.
And in between all this publicity, I get back, you see, each day to my typing, because I think the minute the publicity's finished, they'll be down on me saying, where's that next book, you know?
What intrigues me, if I might ask you, as a writer who writes to deadlines and has done so for years, having not been a writer for all of those years and raised a family, how did you adjust to having to sit down, which you obviously had to do, to discipline yourself to write X number of words every day?
Well, because I am a very determined woman, for a start.
The loving and sacred heart of Jesus might have nothing to do with it.
Oh, no, but I do sometimes think, actually, my mother may have had something to do with my success, you know, really, I do think that.
Of course.
I'm sure she did. Yeah. She'd say, you know, I'll see that she gets a fair crack at the whip. And she always believed I was fantastic anyway, and that I could do anything, you know.
I must say, that story of the loving and sacred heart of Jesus reminded me of the idea of people dispensing blessings and not necessarily being of the cloth.
Yeah.
I remember in Derry, the annual festivity was the Feast of St. Columba, who was the patron saint of Derry, and around St. Columba's Wells, which was it was then known as St. Columba's Wells. Now it's become world famous as the Bogside. Oh. The Bogside, when I was growing up in Derry, was one little street. Now it's like half the city because it's become popular. But anyway, that's another story. But they used to paint all their houses for this parade, this St. Columba's Day parade, and they used to make banners to tie across the street. And one of these banners that was made by the people in the Bogside read, "God bless the Sacred Heart." Oh. So
that was a regular one. That was a regular one.
Of course. So the loving and sacred heart of Jesus man wasn't alone in that.
He gave you the blessing, you know.
God bless the Sacred Heart, indeed. All right, then, can we leave? Will you stay with us, Elaine?
I'd love to. Thank you very much.
Because you might have something to say about our next item as well. Okay, then. That's Elaine Crowley. Lovely book, ladies and gentlemen. It's called Dreams of Other Days. Really, well done. Well done. And just before you go, it strikes me, Elaine, that you have the quintessential, these foreigners wouldn't know, but anybody in the audience who's a Dubliner would know, you have the quintessential Pimlico, Clanbrassil Street, Liberty's accent, with a slight burr of Wales or England on top of it. Isn't it? Isn't it extraordinary? But it's the nuance and the flow and everything.
Oh, yes, because I once saw a programme on the Gate a few years ago where somebody, I can't remember his name, and he did all these different accents,
Yes.
and they are all quite different within the city.
Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And yours is that
area. Well,
absolutely. Yeah.
that's where I learned to talk.
You
and
nearly
like
lost it
that.
when you went to Kimmage. God love you. Anyway, we'll take a break here. Come back in a couple of minutes for the next part. Thank you. All right.